Los Angeles. I was raised in Detroit. I'm actually Canadian born, but spent my childhood in Detroit, Michigan. I was one of those people from a really early age who was completely split between reading and looking, or reading and making. I managed to get through high school doing those things really actively without figuring out what it was. Went to Michigan State University as an art major and remembered feeling quite dissatisfied with art practice. And finally, somebody took me aside after watching what I was doing and said, I think you're a graphic designer, and if you are, you should get out of here and find a better school. And so I had also, I don't know if you've heard this story, Ian, but my high school art teacher was Catherine McCoy's sorority sister.
Oh.
And in that middle of my freshman year, I called up my high school art teacher, and when I was trying to figure out why I wasn't happy as an art major, and she said, oh, you should go meet this old friend of mine. She just took over the design department at Cranbrook. So when I was about 18, I went to Cranbrook, and I met Mike and Kathy McCoy and Ed Fella. And we spent the day together, and it was really, and then I realized, okay, right, this is it. And they said, well, you know, you're welcome to come to Cranbrook, but you have to be a junior. So I went back to Michigan State and was trying to finish 2 years. And then I just, I had this other piece of advice. I realized I was a graphic designer, so I realized really early that this was something I wanted to do. And I think it was in the middle of my sophomore year at Michigan State where I went looking for a summer job, and I walked into a design office and they said, we've got a job, but it starts Monday. Like, this was a Friday. And I just said, okay, I'll do it. And I dropped out of college and took this job immediately. And it was at the same studio where Ed worked. So I was a kind of kid in the back room in Detroit in true industrial fashion. They didn't call you interns, they called them apprentices. So I was an apprentice in this design studio. And that meant in those days matting illustrations to go deliver them to ad agencies, learning how the whole process of graphic design worked, although I kind of knew already because of all this stuff I'd been doing since high school. And then after a while of doing that, then I did enroll in Cranbrook. So I did 2 years at Cranbrook with Mike and Kathy really early. '73 to '75.
Okay.
So some of the things that they were famous for doing, like the vernacular projects, they hadn't actually started that yet, but there was still a great deal of great energy in that program, and the McCoys were so good at getting students to sort of focus on really exploring ideas in design and also making you feel like you could participate at any level you wanted. They were both really interested in history, so there was a constant kind of flow of discussion about that, a lot of reading. You know, Kathy had this bibliography, and I just kind of fit into the program. And the other thing was that this was long before Ed became a student there, but Ed was always around. He was kind of a de facto faculty at Cranbrook, and so the ideas about looking at the vernacular and also, in a way, connecting graphic design to art practice, which was not anything the McCoys would have been dealing with, that was kind of there through Ed.
Okay.
So You know, I did 2 years there. I kind of never wanted to leave, but I did. And then after a short while, I saved up my money and I moved to New York City. And of all places, I ended up working for Massimo Vignelli. And that was, in a way, the polar opposite of what I'd experienced at Cranbrook. Although admittedly, one of the reasons Massimo hired me is he thought, oh, you went to Cranbrook. You must be a hardcore modernist like the Eameses, not realizing that things had moved on from there. And I had this really kind of difficult and complicated relationship with Vignelli, but I was exposed to incredible stuff while I was there because we did all the work for something called the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which was an independent architecture school in Manhattan that was run by Peter Eisenman, funded by Philip Johnson, and it was just this hotbed of discussion around postmodernism and theory. So those things, while they hadn't really started at Cranbrook, I realize now more and more my exposure was as a kid doing that work at Vignelli's and then having a free pass to go to the Institute and witness all these discussions. And at the same time, I got really interested in history because one of the things I couldn't figure out that had really bugged me as a student, and of course, you know, this is a tale of the 70s, is that I couldn't figure out, like even at Cranbrook, like we would look at the early avant-garde, like the Russians, the Bauhaus, and actually, while in the early 70s, that was kind of when the first more serious flood of information about Russian constructivism started getting to the West, like in books that were translated into English, things like that. So, okay, so we're looking at the early avant-garde, and then Kathy was still using Swiss pedagogy, which she had been trained in at Unimark, where she'd worked before she started teaching. And so here we get this kind of early 20s energy in graphic design, great creativity, and then the 50s kind of, in a way, solidifying and almost hardening of it. And at the same time, and of course in the 1970s in the US, all the corporate communications is kind of in the Swiss modernist style. And I was trying to figure out how did that happen? Like, how did it get to the US? And I mean, now that I look back at it, it was so nutty because there was just nothing. And I'd go to the New York Public Library and I'd say, okay, give me 10 years of Gebrauch Grafik, because they had it, like from 1919 to 1929. You know, and I'd literally go through it and I'd try to map everything and anything that I could see referencing to North America. And then, you know, so endless. I started basically with periodicals research. And I was kind of developing this card catalog of references to Europeans coming to the US. And at a certain point, actually, a guy, the editor of Skyline, which was this architectural journal that I was designing in the Vignelli office, I was telling him about this. He said, you know, you could get a master's degree for this. Why are you just doing this? And I thought, oh, okay, right. But then the only places at that time to do design history were in London or in Great Britain, and I couldn't, as a Detroit working class kid, I couldn't imagine figuring out how to study design history overseas. So I thought, and then I realized that everybody I was kind of interested in as this first generation of Americans who were actually implementing modern design was on the faculty at Yale. So I thought, okay, I'll just go there. I know I can get in. And so, you know, and I'll just do my research And of course they'll give me a master's degree for it. And so I did that. Okay, so I'm idealistic and very young, I guess 24, when I started Vignale. And and already at Cranbrook, we were talking about a kind of design that was very contextual and reflexive of whatever you were addressing. You know, design was seen as a kind of organic thing that was really alive. And when I got to Vignale's, I saw something that kind of blew my mind and I didn't expect, although I should have had I just thought about it for a minute, which is that he had managed to templatize his full graphic design practice. Like everything you knew the rules had been set, and it was set so well that he could make a tiny thumbnail sketch and depend on the graphic designer's intelligence with what that template and what the rules were to simply implement it. And of course, this being analog day, like we had a flat file full of acetate grids. Like if you're doing something that's 8.5 inches by 11, here's the 3-column grid for it. You know, that you would then make the grid out your layout boards for the mechanicals. You know, it was just absolutely a set of relationships of typography, and the use of the grid was completely set in stone. And to his credit, it didn't matter whether there was a client with money or a client with no money. In fact, one of my favorite things that we did in the office was we produced a template guidebook for, I think, the National Endowment for the Arts. It was a government project, so there was no money in it. But it was just like how to templatize your in-house communications to sort of clean them up. He was all about the grid and the extension of the template. But of course, at that stage, I was just like, this just blew my mind, and I thought it was bankrupt. The other thing that was kind of hilarious, and of course I didn't realize it till much later, till I was running my own office, is that no one ever rejected a job. Like all the clients who walked into Vignale, they knew exactly what they were going to get and they wanted it. And so we would do the project and they would always be happy and they'd always walk out and everything was completely formally unified. And there were just no questions asked about it. So I thought that it was, you know, in my like 24-year-old egotistic, critical manner, I just thought this was a really emptied out kind of shell of a design practice. And I would ask questions that would just irritate Massimo to no end about this. So that didn't help. And then the other thing was the office was tiny when I worked there. And Massimo and Layla and the office manager and one other employee would use Italian in the office. And I was raised in a bilingual household hearing French, and so after a while I started kind of understanding, and I went to the office manager who'd married an American and who'd raised 2 daughters bilingually, Laura Vanini. She was an amazing woman. And I asked her to help me learn Italian, which she did. And then one day I walked into Vignale's office and just started telling him about one of our clients in Italian, and he just hit the roof. You know, it was a very hierarchical, even in that tiny office, it was extremely hierarchical. It was he was the dad, Layla was the mom. It just was a really difficult thing for a kind of ex-Detroit kid to handle. I did freelance for Milton Glaser. No, that's the funny thing. While I was still in the Vignale office, I decided I needed the antidote. And so I took the Wednesday night, the famous Wednesday night class at SVA that Milton Glaser taught. And that was an amazing experience because you had to show a portfolio to get into that class. So again, like now I don't think I know anything, but back then I thought I knew everything. And so like I make a portfolio and I think I'm really hot and I'm gonna get in this class. And of course I get in the class, and I get into the class thinking, oh my God, all these other people are gonna be, you know, incredibly hot too. And then I discover that Milton has created a class of like 20 people, of people at all different stages of design, like all different abilities, some of them not even graphic designers. It was this really interesting mix of people, but not what I expected. And then, you know, the projects were things like design a calendar, this was 1978, like design a calendar for 1988, a week in 1988, but then fill it with what you're doing that week. And so then the crit was actually 25% about the calendar design and 75% about what did you think you were going to be doing. So it was a really, it was really different than the ways the McCoys would have talked about design. And it was barely formal, which you would have expected from one of the pushpin guys, but it was really psychological and about your kind of intentions as a designer in a very personal way. So again, in contrast to the Vignelli thing where they didn't really want to have a dialogue with their young employees, it was quite interesting. And then when I left the Vignelli office, I let Milton know, and he hired me for a few months on a freelance project. So I was inside Pushpin. Well, at that point it was Milton Glaser Incorporated, right after Vignelli, which was just the weirdest experience in land of contrasts. But all that was when I was still doing this research on mid-century modernists. And I remember talking to Milton about it. And you know, one day I said, oh, I spent the weekend at the New York Public Library. And he's like, well, what are you looking at? And it's like, oh, I was looking at Ladislav Sutnar. He was like, that hack? And I realized that it was because it was, the people I was interested were the generation that the pushpin guys were pushing back against. Like to them, those American modernists were like awful. And so that was a real interesting thing, a perspective, and for me to realize that that I was just much more interested in the cycles of design and the cycles of thinking rather than lionizing a particular kind of design. I mean, and to this day, like backing up, when I look at my own weird history as a kid in New York, working for both Vignelli and Glaser, it's just so, both things were really, really interesting. And I'm not saying I can't make a judgment. I mean, I think that the work at Milton Glaser Incorporated was really thought out more, you know, by a whole different set of criteria that had nothing to do with what Massimo was trying to do, and yet both things at that time were falling under this rather small umbrella of graphic design, which of course has been kind of blown up beyond recognition now. Oh, I think so, yeah. I think in the New York, you know, the world of graphic design in New York back then was pretty small. Like if you went to the AIGA headquarters, which were on 3rd Avenue, I remember signing up as a student rate member. The entire membership was in a shoebox of 3x5 cards that this guy named Nathan Gluck, he'd make out your little 3x5 cards and put it in. And so you'd go to events where everybody was there. That was the same thing going to early Aspen design conferences as a student or something like that. The entire design world would be there, and that was just how small it was. I was always looking for a way to think about design that didn't involve a formal preconception. And, you know, it's interesting, like when I think about my long relationship with Ed Fella, you know, as a friend and colleague for 40-some years, and Ed speaks entirely through form, but it's that day or it's that minute, it's got this kind of reflexiveness. And that is always what I was interested in. And so I understood my interest in these kind of weird American modernists to be because of them not quite getting it right. Like, as much as I love the Swiss modernists, that was like elegant, correct, not polluted by kind of, at least on the kind of formal read, not polluted by commercial concerns. Whereas the Americans, like, if you look like at somebody like Paul Rand, although everybody talks about him as if he was God, his work's all over the place. And in fact, and you know, again, going back to a sort of very memorable conversation very early with Kathy McCoy, when I started asking questions about, well, what happened in the United States in the 1930s, her response was, oh, it's all a mess. Well, it is a mess, but it's an interesting mess. And so I kind of think that that's where my empathy and interest was. And actually, I always blame that. I mentioned the MC5. I always blame it on a really important aesthetic experience of my teenage years was growing up in Detroit when there was this really crazy and intense rock and roll scene, which would be not unlike kind of an early punk scene, and where you saw people, you know, in the most amateurish and passionate ways creating incredible stuff with no rules whatsoever. And so to me, the idea that graphic design would be circumscribed by a set of rules. I know I chose rules in your lightning round, but it's because rules loom so large, like whether or not you are going to obey them or not obey them, or how do you twist them. And you know, to me, the American thing, what was so fascinating was to see the European emigres come and morph their work to suit the American market, and then the Americans kind of almost learning about it by rumor, you know, in a way, or magazine articles, interpreting it and creating it. I found that kind of messy stew of translation of modernism into the American context to be interesting in a way that I think did reflect this inner idea that I had about design being a kind of more organic and more thoughtful practice. I mean, the truth is, again, if I look at when I came into New York, okay, you had Vignelli, you had Chermayeff and Geismar doing like Mobil Oil, Philip Morris, Xerox, IBM. I guess a lot of people were doing IBM work. It was still all passing through the approval of Paul Rand. Anspach, Grossman, Portugal. There were all these kind of offices that translated modernist thinking into very, very economically successful corporate practices. And that loomed so large, and it looked like you couldn't penetrate it. And so, like, the other thing that was going on, obviously, is there was a lot of, you know, on the flip side, totally disconnected from all that was, in 1977, the punk scene in New York, and a lot of independent art stuff. You know, not the mega galleries that we all know today, but a much more diffuse and almost still partially underground art world that also was making artifacts. And so, you know, you had those things going on, and then you look at graphic design. And to be honest, I didn't even have the words to express it back then, but now I realize it was male, it was patriarchal, you know, it was like these hot, tough offices run by men who, there weren't even that many women in graphic design. It was different. I mean, you know, one of the things, I mean, this is a little bit of a divergence, what I'm about to talk about, but one of the things that I find sort of upsetting is that in the art world, there is a thing about, oh, artists' books and artists', you know, works in print that is kept separate from graphic design. Like, I think somebody should come along and look at those things more comprehensively, because then you would end up opening it up. Although I also really agree with Martha Scottford that the true history of women in design, it's there, it's just not been fully parsed out in terms of who actually implemented some of the work, or, you know, the kind of tiers of employees, the unacknowledged labor and all that it's all there. But it was different. I mean, I'm going to jump, I haven't talked about Yale yet, but when I got to Los Angeles, I will tell this.
That's cool, that's cool.
Because to me, it's the most crazy thing. When I got here, because I was hired to be the head of CalArt's graphic design department, the local AIGA invited me to attend a meeting of their board. And in those days, it was Saul Bass and James Cross and Ray Eames and April Greiman and Deborah Sussman and Sheila DeBretteville. And I remember coming in and sitting down at the table, and there were, yeah, April, Sheila, Ray, and Deborah. And I just remember thinking, oh, I am not in New York. Like, there would be no table like that in New York City in 1985. Whereas in Los Angeles it was. And that immediately was like the signal to me that I was in a really different place. So that was good. But it was just one of those funny moments, watching Ray leave the meeting and go into her beautiful black Jaguar and drive off. But back to sort of my trajectory. So I was sitting in my studio apartment in New York City, freelancing, and then still doing this research. I really I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but then I had this advice from this friend, like, go to grad school. So I apply to Yale, I get in, and I think, again, because I'm still kind of in this realm of thinking I know everything, I think, I'm just going to barely do whatever I have to do to graduate from the graphic design program. I'm just going to take every art history class and you name it that I can, and do this history of what I really decided to focus on was graphic design in the United States from 1935 to 1955. That was my thesis. And I immediately hit the wall of Paul Rand and Bradbury Thompson, and actually her matter was there, but he didn't object. But especially Paul Rand, they were just like, this is not a legitimate topic. And I was so, I couldn't figure out why these guys were so resistant. And they could not historicize their own work. Like, they could not, like, I'll give you an example. I was in a typography class with Bradbury Thompson, and he was telling us his rules circa 1980, which was you can only use one typeface, you can only use it in one point size, maybe you can vary a weight, you know, like you've got to develop a grid, this like type restriction. And I remember saying to him, but in 1953, and I even had the example, like you used 7 fonts in this piece. And him looking at me and going, why would you want your work to look like 1953? And it's like, I don't. I'm just saying that I don't understand where this rule is coming from. And he had no answer other than that, well, this is contemporary design. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, no, it's not. You know, it was just this kind of, I was chafing against this kind of set of rules. And at the same time, you know, Paul Rand was questioning the legitimacy of it as a subject at all. You know, he would constantly say things like, why don't you do your thesis about Elizitsky? You know, and now there was a good designer. And, you know, I'd say, well, because I don't read Russian. And it's like, well, yeah, but you weren't born in 1945, so why are you trying to write about it? It's like, wait a minute, if history were only written by people who were writing in the period, it's like, what's that? So anyway, it was just kind of great resistance to it. And as a result, I did do this study, but I never published it because I just, by the end of grad school, had been so somehow discombobulated by that resistance that I didn't quite know what to do with it. Europeans in America is kind of a synopsis of my thesis. The other place it appeared was in ID Magazine. I knew the editor of ID Magazine and I sent her my thesis and it was sort of serialized in ID Magazine. And so it did get out in the world and it attracted notice. And I would get, in fact, I think I met Stephen Heller around that time and Roger Remington and all those people. But what I really, oh, and then there was the first, I think it was 82 or 83, where there was the first design history conference in the United States that Massimo, of all people, gave a address that said, we need graphic design history, which I had feelings about. And yet it's still seen as a kind of seminal statement about the necessity for graphic design history to develop, which, great. What I resisted, or what I really objected to, was that list of guys, again, you know, Rand, Thompson, Will Burton, Lester Beale, Ladislav Sutnar, etc., being turned into heroes. Like, I think, isn't Roger Remington's book is called like 9 Pioneers of Graphic Design. If you read that book, most of what is in that book I wrote about. And I would never have described them as pioneers. Like, to me, that very word described an unknown, when in fact, if it had been called 9 synthesizers of American graphic design, I would have been fine with it. I don't see graphic design as a heroic activity. I see it as a really interesting cultural activity, one that is almost invariably caught in a web of influence. So this language of, you know, genius and pioneership, I found completely annoying. And so I sort of decided that I wouldn't do it anymore. And while I was doing my thesis research at Yale, the one thing that really struck me were these essays by Alvin Lustig. And Alvin Lustig writing in the early 1950s, although he died in 54, but he was writing prolifically about what it was like to be a graphic designer at that point in time. And it struck me as I had been doing that research at that point now for like 3 solid years of library digging, that the rarest thing was to find an account by anybody of what it was like to work then. Like you couldn't, to me, I couldn't count a thing like Rand's thoughts on design, because that feels like, you know, Moses and the 10 Commandments. It's like him putting his thoughts down for everybody, whereas Lustig is writing personally, writing what he sees and how he's responding to it. And so I thought, that's my model. I'll just write about the contemporary. And that's basically what I've done since 1983. I went back to New York after May of '82, and I went to New York, and then I realized that if I went back to New York, I'd end up having to work in those same offices again that I'd already worked in. And I thought, no, I need an adventure. And at that point, John and I had been dating already, and he took a job in Houston. So I decided to follow him to Houston 6 months in. But when I went to Houston, I had a project in hand which was really, really important, which was that when I was at Yale, I had designed an issue of Perspecta, the architecture magazine. And in it, there was an article with no words. It was just a sequence of images that had been given to me without any directions by an architect named John Haydick, Haydick ran the architecture school at Cooper Union. He was a very, very influential and interesting American architect. And after Perspecta 19 came out, he contacted me and he said, I have a contract to do a monograph on my work with Rizzoli. Will you design it with me? And at that point I said, well, I'm moving to Houston. But in those days it took 2 years to make a book. So we just agreed that I would take this job with me to Houston. And so I, flew back and forth every once in a while. And I think that book came out in 1985. But it was really an important, it kind of launched my work as a book designer. And it had this character that was remarkably different from other architecture books of the time. It is, I mean, when you look at it now, it's kind of it's got some obvious postmodern gestures, but it's all about rethinking the structure of the way that the work is organized. It's got this kind of aggressive structure to it. And that really helped me realize that that's kind of what I wanted to keep. That was the area I wanted to keep working in. I also I knew I wanted to teach, and I liked the idea in those days that books took forever, so you could teach while you did them. It's not quite true now. Or it's just much more difficult because everything's so accelerated. But back in that day, you'd spec your type and then you'd have to wait 7 or 8 weeks for the type to come back from the typesetter. So you had all this downtime where you could do other things. And so I was sitting in Houston. I was just doing part-time teaching at the University of Houston. I was actually hired in the architecture school because the dean wanted some architecture publications and he knew that the university publishers couldn't do them. So I did that and I worked on John Haydick's book, and in the middle of it I wrote a really, not a nasty, in retrospect to me, a very mild article questioning graphic design education that was published by the Society for Typographic Arts in Chicago. And based on that, I was, CalArts reached out to me. Not very long, because John and I had been in Houston at that point for like a couple years, and it was sort of like, is this really where we're going to live, or do we want to go somewhere else? And Houston was amazing, but it's a town of boom and bust, and he was in the middle of doing his kind of architecture, not internship, but that period of time where you have to work for an architect with a license for 3 years in order to get your own license. So it was just timely for us to make some kind of move. So I decided to apply for it, and but I had never even been to Los Angeles until I'd come out to interview for the job at CalArts. So, and they had a big decision to make at that point. There was actually my competition was Lori Haycock, who was already teaching there, and who, the minute as a visitor I sat in her class, and I remember thinking, if I get this job, I have to make sure she doesn't go anywhere, because she was doing really interesting things, but she didn't have a master's degree. She actually ended up leaving and going to Cranbrook to get her master's, along with Scott Macklin. Okay. And anyway, and then there was another artist who was applying for the job, so they really had to kind of decide, and they decided that somebody who was coming in like me, who said, I want to teach graphic design, but I don't want it to be a trade school. At that point, Art Center was really preparing people for the advertising business, and I just thought, okay, they're taking care of that. We don't need to do it. We can deal with graphic design again as a kind of this synthetic practice that I always saw it as. And so they, Catherine Lord, who was the dean at the time, thought that was compelling and brought me in. Well, I was allowed to bring one part-time hire, and so I brought Jeff Keedy, who I had met as, I had, I think, returned to Cranbrook for, I don't know why, I was at Cranbrook some time during that period while I lived in Texas, but I'd met him and Jan Jancourt and Karen Aono and a whole group of people, and I was really interested in the work that Jeff was doing. And so so when I was able to bring somebody in, I asked him if they wanted to do it, and he did. And then the following year, I think he was made full-time. Yeah. And I also knew at that point that Ed was going to Cranbrook. And so I sort of, along with Catherine Lord, sort of strategized on how to make sure that when he got out, we had a line for him. Okay. So really, Ed and Jeff were my hires. Well, one interesting thing about getting here in 1985 is I feel like there was the hangover of the Olympics. Okay. The '84 Olympics. The Olympics were the all-employment program for graphic design in Los Angeles. Like every design office had a chunk of it. There was so much work, and there was a lot of energy. And the other thing is, in 1985, there were still a lot of more corporate headquarters in LA in things outside of the entertainment business. I mean, there's still a lot of aerospace, but there was a lot more aerospace then. There was a lot of financial stuff. There was like big food conglomerates, stuff like that. So a lot of offices had very lucrative, there were a lot of offices with 12, 15, 20 people doing annual reports and all kinds of, obviously, printed communications. And so it felt like there was it felt like a kind of identifiable community of graphic designers. And then you had, of course, the onset of digital technology, which for a long time was more powerful in the schools than it was in the offices. The offices were hiring young designers to help them adapt. Actually, one of the funny things about about CalArts. You've probably heard this anecdote before. When I got to LA, I decided to interview various people who ran studios to talk to them just about how they saw the landscape of the design education in LA, who they were hiring, etc. And this one guy said to me, if I just want somebody to just do the job exactly as I tell them to do it, if not better, I'll hire an art center student. But if I want somebody who's maybe not so competent, but who's really interesting, and certainly somebody I'd want to go talk to at lunchtime, I'll hire a CalArts student. So I thought, okay, like what you're telling me is we don't really have to worry about that skill thing, because I didn't really care about it terribly either. And, the thing that brought that to a halt was the computer, because all of a sudden, it's true, we couldn't teach people to use X-Acto blades to save our lives, and nobody cared that much about it. But on the other hand, we did kind of jump in full to trying to use the Apple. I mean, like a lot of other places, now that you talk about it, it's like being sold drugs. They'd offer us a machine, then you'd get 2 for 1. They were really kind of partnering up with the schools to make sure that you were using their equipment and developing it. And so suddenly the students had this skill that people really needed. But at the same, that was fully operational by the early 90s, when we had a recession here and then a series of, infamous events like the big earthquake, the riot, the sort of recession, and that started the process of the LA offices shrinking. A lot of those headquarters moving out who had been clients, there were suddenly, the offices started getting smaller. And to the point now where I think there are countless 2-person and 3-person offices in LA. I don't even know who they all are. And I know tons of them are our own students, but it's just, now it's like, to me graphic design is atomized, into small practices that don't have this kind of infrastructure. But as a result, I think it's really hard to get a sense of the design community that there was, back in that early day. But I think what I'm saying might be absolute. I don't know whether or not people would echo it in New York. I think there's still this kind of weird dominance in New York of a few offices. I went to the TypeCon at Cooper Union in June, and if there were, like, let's just say there were 20 speakers, like 15 of them had worked at Pentagram.
Right.
And I even said something to one of the organizers, and he said, "Oh God, yeah, I'm sorry, we said to ourselves, next time we have to read the resumes more carefully." But like, to me, that's very New York, whereas you couldn't do that here.
Yeah.
There's no center quite like that, or like 2x4 or anything. There's no dominant graphic design office that still does everything. It's much more specialized, much more niche. I actually think it's a feature. If I am really true to my own ethos of design not being this megalithic, rule-bound practice, then to me the logic of where it's gone is right. I'm not trying to downgrade graphic design as an activity. I'm just saying that it's more realistic, that it would have this kind of diversity and diversity of uses. I think it makes it, what it's put into question are all the old school ways of quantifying it, like for instance, design competitions. Like, does anybody look at those anymore? Like, I don't think the reasons for them being not so interesting are that, again, the practice has diversified so widely that the kind of issue of a kind of stable criteria is really in question. And it even goes into, of course, into design education, which is all what the Yale conference was about this moment now, where I think there are certain things that still hold some essence of a kind of design thinking process, like typography. To me, the kind of both understanding the sort of historical structure and contemporary structure of typography, both in the detail of font design and then the implementation of usage. To me, that kind of fulfills a sort of panoply of a mental structure of design. I, of course, think the more you know about the history of it, it's also powerful to understand how it's operated. But then to go on and say, oh, and this is what now you should be doing with it, that's the part that's really the mystery. And wide open to interpretation, quite rightly. Okay, so I still teach it in a very old school manner, which I'm fully aware of all the pitfalls and the critique of it, but I do it for a very specific reason. I start in the middle of the 19th century, and we now get up to 1990 over the course of 30 lectures. And the reason I've held on to the chronology all these years has a lot to do with Cal Arts, in that we don't have most students have a very, very fuzzy understanding of history, period. And so you can't, like if you jump around, like with our students, if you use topics rather than chronology, you will never have somebody understanding kind of how things really evolved. So I do stick to a kind of vaguely chronological presentation, but I do kind of wander. The other thing I've done for years is I integrate a lot of architecture and urbanism and industrial design and furniture and cars and the things of the built world. And that is because I also think that you can't really talk about graphic design without that context. So it's true, I don't get in deep into the weeds on certain important graphic design historical figures. Like, I've always felt guilty when I get to Jan Tschichold, because like, oh my God, you could speak an entire semester about Jan Tschichold, but now that Jeff teaches type history, he can talk about Jan Tschichold, and I can place Tschichold in context. And that's really what the students need. And I think that over the years, what I've come to understand is that it works for the Cal Arts students. In some other place, it would probably seem, I don't know, uncreative or something, or it might seem redundant to other history classes. But I can never count on anybody knowing anything in my class. Like, just getting the chronology straight is important.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And understanding where the built world comes from, you know, and that there are ideas in all of it. Like, to me, the big revelation of design history for most design students is the intentionality behind things. And that the ideas were shared in common, that they're ideas that Frank Lloyd Wright had that then are echoed in, you know, wacky American Art Nouveau commercial vernacular, you know, this like adoration of nature, like the connection to the arts and crafts, you know, that kind of web of influence then. The sort of knocking off of Asian design, you know, the Orientalism of the turn of the century. You know, all of that stuff is really important. And it's not overtly political, but it is political in the end, and it's really interesting now I've noticed that students react to it much more viscerally, especially the stuff about cultural borrowing. I think one of the things I think is kind of a challenge of this moment is, to me as an older designer, to try to open up the subject of design in such a way that people can recognize that the moment we're in now is, on one hand, I think unique, but on another hand, there are other designers from the past who addressed issues that were also important in the same kind of socially active ways. That it's not a new, that for instance, radical design, whatever that may be, that there have been moments of it all along. And so the historian part of me wants to say, hey, you're not alone. On the other hand, I do understand, as I've referenced my own ego of being a young designer, I understand the impulse to say, no, I'm going to reinvent it now. And that's great. About CalArts starting a design history class from the very beginning. So to me, that's a really interesting thing. You have a school put together in 1969, 1970. No other American graphic design departments are teaching design history. I think there were a few, I know that back in Detroit, for instance, I knew there was a guy who taught industrial design history, like the history of car design, the history, and certainly in architecture, it's full of architecture historians, but there were very few people teaching graphic design history. So Keith Goddard, a British graphic designer who lives in New York, starts this class. And given that the intentions of CalArts back at the very beginning were a kind of questioning, radical rethinking, the issue of graphic design history was to give graphic design an intellectual dimension, or was to kind of let it in, tie it to cultural and intellectual constructs. So instead of creating a graphic design department at CalArts that was solely devoted to contemporary trade practice, the idea to make young designers more independent was to give them some history. So he taught it, and then Lou Danziger taught it, took it up and taught it for a very long time, and then I took it over from him. So it's always been part of CalArts, and I think it's actually been part of the DNA, that it's part of the DNA of the School of Art, that there's this class that's always been there tying, making this case for design as, and it's, I feel like even, that it's helped people in describing their own work. It's one of those weird things where, the great part of it is we have spun out several people, yourself included, who've actually taken it really seriously and gone even further with it. I'm really deeply proud of that. But even for the people who never think about it again, I still know it's been a really critical part of their growth at CalArts. And that it's one of the things that makes a lot of the work. My feeling about CalArts work is that it's very smart, and that it's partially comes out of that exposure and that kind of way it enters the studio discussions, or that it creates a kind of common language. Well, we do a lot of projects because of the nature of my work of doing a lot of museum catalogs and a lot of scholarly books. There are a lot of things where we have to do some research or kind of understand the context of the work that we're going to make. And I'm always, I've always felt very critical about work that attempts to mimic the past and somehow does it clumsily. And I know what this comes out of. It does come out of all those books that were published like from the late 70s through the early 80s on Russian constructivism that were done in fake constructivist style, and they just looked so unbelievably awful to me. And so, and yet I did all these historical books on history. In fact, one of them, was I working on that while I was at Agenda? I did that very early book on the case study houses. So I would look at arts and architecture and the kind of typographic, the use of typography in those magazines, and then interpret it really carefully into the book that I did. But I knew to look there, whereas again, if I'd stuck to the kind of modernist Yale training, you would never have looked at a historical document in order to come up with your own work, So it's always been there. Even when I was in Reverb, we were kind of infamous for our research that we did on projects. And I've always felt that kind of background to help guide the formal choices that I would end up making. Or that as a studio we would make to this day at Green Dragon. We are very kind of careful about what we're looking at in order to make the work be more alive to the subject without this kind of horrible mimicry. It's actually, I left Reverb in 1996, and I basically moved back home, and I started working off the dining room table in my house and out of the garage. I think there's an iMagazine interview that shows me in the garage with my daughter, who's a toddler at the time. And I've always, in a weird way, I was thinking about this. I've kind of worked to find people to work with where we approach the work not that differently than the way I approach thinking about work in the context of CalArts. So to me, there's a fairly seamless connection to the sort of intellectual and formal, conceptual issues in my office as there is what we're talking about at school. And certainly one of the things that's kept me teaching all these years is that, to me, the kind of interchange of ideas at school is also what keeps my design practice alive. So it's really, they're so intertwined to me. And then, over the years, I've had long-term, people who've worked with me over a long period of time. Like Stuart Smith is a good example, where we worked for many years, both in Green Dragon and then at LACMA, and we teach together. Ching, I think, is now 10 or 11 years working together. Like, I feel like we're co-authoring our work, and I'm perfectly happy and comfortable in that relationship because the work stems out of the dialogue and the exchange of ideas that come out of our sort of shared understanding of what is interesting in graphic design. So that connection, in a way, to teaching is really critical to me. I have, my title is Creative Design Consultant, which means that I sort of hover over the graphic design department. So you talked to David Carwan. I work with David, with Michael Permosen, who also runs that department with Lisa Mark, who's the head of publications. And we sort of construct ideas about using design at the museum, but we also talk with the education department and the marketing department and even, you know, what they call visitor services, like having to do with what the experience on campus is. It's really, really comprehensive. And the reason I'm there is that Michael Govan, who's the director of the museum, is really interested and very informed about design and the way that it can, you know, really enhance the museum itself. And so when he first got there 10 years ago, he had been at DIA and he'd worked with 2x4, and he had hired 2x4 to do a kind of quickie LACMA identity. And I think I came in 5 years later, and actually one of the reasons he brought me in was that the identity had been adapted, but it hadn't been, he just couldn't get the design department to do what he wanted it to do. And so what I found out was that they never fully adapted the 2x4 identity, and it wasn't that not everything that 2x4 identity had done was workable, like they'd done it from a long distance and really quick, but there were ideas in there that could be expanded. So again, I'm telling you this story because it's typical of me not to come in and say, okay, get rid of it, we're going to start over, it's going to be the Lorraine Wild identity. But instead I was like, okay, what have you guys had? And let's figure out how to make that work. And so we've done that. And you know, a whole lot of things have happened in the meantime, like the ascendancy of social media for communication, you know, the use of the web and all that are really sort of challenging how to keep an identity coherent and growing. And also they're facing this big building program where they're tearing down 2/3 of the museum. And so we're going to be thinking about how design continues to thrive in that. So I have kind of this interesting, it's actually the first time I've ever worked with an institution this big. And it's just fascinating. There are, I mean, I have all kinds of things that I really like. I mean, I actually love, I'm going to start with the Swiss. I love the Max Bill Oeuvre Complète of Le Corbusier. I've always thought that that's an incredibly beautiful modernist book. So I really love, even though I'm not a modernist typographer, I love the modernist typography era for a kind of precision. I have this one weird collecting habit where I collect books that were produced by something called the Bollingen Foundation, which was it was a foundation, I want to say, I'm probably going to screw this up, but I think they were out of Princeton, where they did books in, mostly in the 50s and 60s, that covered philosophy and history and literature. Actually, Paul Rand did a lot of Bollingen book covers, which is what got me interested in Bollingen. Herbert Bayer did some Bollingen work. But they're very academic, and many of them are just really incredibly high quality vernacular classicism. And I've learned a lot about typography from those books. So I will go to a used bookstore and just look for their indicia, and they're all on really odd, arcane subjects. And by a whole variety of designers, but they just have this kind of level of quality to them. That famous book on the I Ching that was printed in the bazillions, I'm pretty sure that's a Bollingen book.
Okay.
It's funny because I have some of, in my own collection, I have some of Jan Schickold's classical books. Like he did one on Chinese painting. Have you ever seen that book?
Yeah, I got a copy.
Yeah, no, I'm very thrilled to own that. The other thing, because I'm kind of a printing fanatic, another one of my weird book collecting categories is books on any subject printed by gravure in Japan. So I have all these, you know, great gravure books, including the first edition of, what is it, 5 eggs, how to pack 5 eggs. And these great early, like 50s books on Japanese design that are both beautifully designed and unbelievably printed. And then that leads me to the whole subject of photography books, because I'm really fond of, you know, I feel like I learned a lot about graphic design, about these sort of filmic aspects of sequencing images from both looking at old issues of Brodovich's Harper's Bazaar and looking at William Klein's great photo books on cities, and even the photo sequencing of somebody like Robert Frank. Movie editing, film editing, that what's Thelma's last? Thelma Schoonmaker, the editor for Martin Scorsese. Like, to me, I felt like I've learned tons by looking at film editing more with the eye of a graphic designer rather than, you know, sometimes having to see a movie twice, once just to enjoy it, and the next time to watch how it's done. I mean, that goes for me all the way back to high school, like seeing Haskell Wexler's movies and Tulane Blacktop and things like that, sort of late 60s, early 70s filmmaking. So all that's part of my visual. I mean, it's not a collection, obviously, but it's a kind of mental, what I walk around with mentally. Oh God, Dwiggin. I mean, I can go on and on. My library, which, as many people know, has been in storage for ages, is like 100,000 books. So.
Okay.
It's crazy.